California standardized assessment, as opposed to something that resemble what the game is trying to teach. So there is a positive effect, but we felt that's not very pleasing because of all of the reasons that I mentioned before. No, I can't seem to move this. There we go. Okay. So here is another way of thinking about how to model these data. So let's forget for the moment that we have potentially varying item sets with 20 that are the same and some that are only shown up in the pretest and some only showed up in post-test. Let's say we have only 4 items, very simple case, 4 items that are repeated over time, 2 occasions. So there's initial status. There is also potentially at a second occasion, you have the same items administered to the same group of people twice. And here is what's shown is a model that is a path diagram for a between school or site level model. So let's think of each school having some initial status. And each school, there's possibly not an observed change, but a latent change variable. And this would give you almost a bifactor-like model or a multidimensional IRT model in general that would serve to estimate, conditional on the school's initial status, what is the school's latent change at post-test. So this is between schools. Now, for within each of the schools, you still have the same items, but the items are at the individual level, they are measuring also initial status and latent change variables. These could be thought of as individuals' deviations of initial status from the school's average initial status and the school's latent change deviations. These little guys at the top are representing over time residual dependence. So we mentioned that if you use the same items and over 2 occasions, you would get some degree of residual correlation, even if you condition on these main latent variables of interest. So those are sitting there, basically serving as residual correlations. And then the control initial status and control latent change, this part of the model gives you an estimate of potential differences for the control classrooms, and this gives you another set of differences for the treatment classrooms. So altogether, for this very simple model with only a simple situation with only 4 items, treatment and control, and a multi-level setup of individuals nested within schools, we would have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of these big main latent variables of interest, plus however many little latent variables representing residual dependence over time. And what that buys you is a full account of the both the lack of full exchangeability between the treatment control classrooms, an accounting of individuals are nested within sites, and then accounting of the items are repeated over time. So if you want equations, then these are what the equations look like. At pretest, we have a pretest control classroom, the pretest school initial status latent variable, plus the deviation of any individual in the control condition from that average, plus residual dependence. And for the control condition in post-test, you have the same set of latent variables. These are essentially where you started. This is a component of change. This is the school level theta 2k. This is the school level latent change variable, plus something that is an individual level latent change for the control conditions. And the same is repeated for the pretest and post-test for the treatment classrooms. So what that gives us is that if you focus your attention on these variables, eta 2 and eta 4, these are really targeting at the latent change. And then our treatment efficacy comparison becomes one of, does the treatment lead to more learning in the in a gaming condition where students play the math games compared to those control classrooms? Okay, and then here is a comparison. So the y-axis was plotted. These are the latent variable estimates, as opposed to observed scores. You're still looking at treatment and control differences. So here are treatment, here are controls. You know, at the pre-test, they're here. At post-test, the control folks are about here. Because you're looking at latent gain or latent change, the variability is much, much smaller compared to the overall variability at post-test. And then it appears that for treatment classrooms, there is a visible gain from pre to post. And for the controls, there's not so much of a difference. So if you look at that by site, we have the same story. Here are the estimates coming out of the same impact models, but applied to an outcome variable that comes out of a multi-level, multi-dimensional IRT model. And here we have a much larger estimate of the treatment versus control differences. And if you look at the differences by school, then all but one of the schools have a significant they have an impact estimates that are all significantly different from 0, with exception of school number 8. And if we focus then on effect size, and there are multiple ways of computing effect sizes, the Cohen's delta or Cohen's d really is just looking at the standard deviation of the outcome, and that's the scaling unit. You look at your raw unstandardized regression coefficient for indication of treatment effect, dividing by that. Hedges effect size, this is basically a model-based version of Cohen's delta. It has the level 1 residual variance and all the necessary components in a multi-site trial to capture the initial status and treatment effect differences. And then there's also a conditional effect size, which is popularized by the optimal design software. The raw score effect size estimates are over here. So if we focus on, let's say, the Hedges effect size or Cohen's delta, they're about 0.2, as I mentioned. Not negligible, but nothing to be quite excited about, perhaps, because after all, we have indeed spent a lot of money and time and effort developing these assessments and developing these games. On the other hand, I argue that what you should be looking at is the latent differences of how people might change. And when you do that, the effect size comes out to be something that's several times larger than the raw score based estimates. And we thought that that is both refreshing to know and gave us a bit more thinking about how to approach measurement and design issues and data analysis issues in multi-site trials. And this is not routine because fitting these multi-level models, the ones that I've shown you, these things they're not trivial until perhaps a few years ago. But we can actually fit these models that are measurement models in nature, but they also reflect the research design. And they take out the potential lack of precision and partial out the measurement error, so that you wind up getting something that is much more effective in terms of detecting change. So in sum, I'm attempting to argue that the integration of a domain understanding, which in the beginning guided the design of intervention, the design of the assessment to evaluate the outcomes, and the psychometric analysis and the impact modeling, if you have the same conceptual picture in mind, then you will come to a much different picture compared to the cases where you are throwing over the fence, that the design folks thought that we're going to give the psychometricians these items. You guys do whatever magic you have to do to them. And then the psychometricians say, well, we're going to give you these scaled scores, and the multi-level modelers do whatever you have to do with them. We don't care. I think that we have to talk to one another. And of course, it gave me a lot of thinking about how to assume full exchangeability, which is really critical for a lot of these modeling activities versus conditional exchangeability, and conditioning on observed covariates, conditioning on latent variables, random effects. And psychometric models in general, the correlational models in nature, they should reflect experimental design. Cronbach argued for an integration a long time ago. I don't know if we're there, but we do know is that if you improve measurement activities, you're going to increase sensitivity in terms of effectiveness of your intervention. And what that meant is that either you could probably detect the effect with statistical significance and still say something about it, but you don't have to recruit so many sites. Or that you could, if you're thinking, putting my shoes in terms of thinking like a policymaker or a funder, I could then fund more studies, and they could vary in different kinds of conditions to really see the differences. Okay, so that's it. Thank you.
Well, from this morning's presentation by MJ, you can see it's a lot of fun to work with people like that. That's pretty much the way it is in Glass Lab and a lot of other projects I've worked on, including CATS, ones with Cisco, others with colleagues at SRI and ETS. And in order to do things like game-based assessment, simulation-based assessment, you have to have a lot of people who know different things and their work come together. In Glass Lab, for example, we've got learning scientists, software engineers, game designers, subject matter experts, psychometricians. And I would say it probably took us like about 6 months to even be able to talk with one another. Sometimes we use different words for different concepts, and that's a lot of trouble that you see at first. Other times we use the same words to talk about different concepts, and that's trouble too, but you don't find that out quite right away. So what I'm going to talk about today is what are some of the key ideas from assessment design that are important for other people who are working together with us in the same project. And in the same way, they have important things to tell us as well. These are some of the things that you figure out in the first 6 months. So maybe with this talk, I can cut a month or two off that process for the projects that you work on. Okay, here's a screenshot from the first game that came out of Glass Lab. SimCity EDU Pollution Challenge. You can see it's sort of a SimCity world that people work in. You're the mayor and you're trying to do things like reduce pollution in your city, but without hurting the level of jobs. And this whole game is about learning the concepts of systems thinking, to learn things like negative feedback about multiple causes, importantly, unintended consequences. Our targeted learners are middle school students and members of Congress. So here's the first thing, that assessment design principles and game design principles build on the same principles of learning. This is one of the points that came up in a number of earlier talks, that assessment and games don't have to be enemies. When you're building an artifact that's trying to do multiple things at once, you will certainly have constraints that trade off against one another. But the good news is that inherently, at their foundation, they need to build off the same principles around the same phenomena. So, what do I mean by that? What I mean is that in what you might call the personal level, we have all of these experiences as we understand them, as we experience them, as we make plans, we see what's important, whether it's brushing our teeth or heading off on a quest or making friends, things like that. There are all these unique experiences that every one of us have. Now, how can it be that they are unique, yet we seem to get along? The reason is that there are patterns of things that we know and the ways that we interact that are shared across people. Some of them are very broadly shared, like languages, including all the tiniest pieces and the larger ones. Others are much more local. What are the patterns of interaction in a particular classroom? But it's because our person level unique experiences are built around patterns of activity and knowledge that are shared across multiple people, across multiple situations. What makes it possible for us to do that as individuals is that in our brains, we are building up attunements to what those patterns are so that we come to recognize them. We see when they're happening. We build up ideas of what we can do in those situations, whether to further them, whether to resist them, whether there are ways we can create situations. We do this by having experiences that are built around them. Some of these happen quite naturally, like when we learn our first language. Others take a little more work. Others take conscious effort by people to afford experiences that learners can pick up some of those things that aren't quite as natural, like subtracting mixed numbers or troubleshooting computer networks. So what does this mean for games? Well, for games, it means we're trying to build these environments where players will have experiences. They're built around recurring patterns. Some of them have to do with the play in the game. Others have to do, like in Pollution City, things like words for talking about interacting systems that you can learn to think about to solve problems in terms of those systems. What it means for learning is that the situations that you build around are ones that have the key features of those recurring patterns and affordances, ways that you can act in them. What it means for assessment is that in situations, are they built around the right features? What will people say or do or make that will give you clues as to what they understand, what they can do in those situations for some purpose? Maybe feeding back to teachers, maybe to the students themselves, maybe to the game as to what to do next. But that's what the assessment part is about. So what does this mean for game-based assessment, like Pollution City? It means you have to do all those things at once. From the point of view of the player, there are situations, maybe you're on a quest, you have things that you can do, that's how you experience it. At the same time, for the game designer, that has to work in order to have an engaging experience. The situations you're in, the things you can do, move the story along. They give you rewards, they give you challenges. So that's how it has to work from point of view of game design. From the point of view of learning, those situations have to build around what are some of the targeted kinds of knowledge, like systems thinking or mixed number subtractions that are important to learn. And for assessment, it means, are you getting clues from what people say or do or make that give you the right information for feedback, whether it's at the level of state school officers or the teachers or the student or for the system itself. You can have feedback loops at many different cycles going on at the same time that might need different information, but they're all about getting information to make sense of what's happening. Okay, so number two, the point is that assessment isn't really about numbers, it's about the structure of reasoning. Yeah, there are some numbers, and as you saw a minute ago, there are some Greek letters too, but that's not really what the game designers need to worry about. What they need to worry about is, well, Sam Messick put it very well. He said assessment is about getting information for some purpose about what people know or can do or ways they can participate. Can't see that directly, so you have to say, well, what kinds of things do I need to see people say or do or make to give me clues about that? In what kinds of situations, with what features? And you can see that that's a general structure that may play out very differently for different kinds of assessments, and also different assessments framed under different psychological perspectives. That's a problem that B.F. Skinner would face, designing assessments from a behaviorist point of view, but it's also a problem that Jim Greeno would face, designing assessments from a sociocognitive point of view. So the principles of assessment design will play out in sometimes rather different ways on the surface, but building around the same argument structures as they're needed to give you information for whatever feedback cycle sizes, from however you're construing the nature of learning and the nature of evidence in those situations. In familiar kinds of assessments, Zoran yesterday in his lunch talk, in his very engaging way, said some rather provocative things to make people think about what is psychometrics. And although I certainly disagreed with points of what he said, it's certainly the case that like 99.8% of what is done in the world that's called psychometrics is pretty much the stereotype that he talked about. The models don't know this, and what we are doing is saying, well, yeah, one root of the history of psychometrics is kind of what the name says, mental measurement, but another root came about of trying to make sense of noisy, complex data with holes in it, uncertain. What evidence was the value of evidence that it would give you for whatever purpose you needed to put it to? So that's the way that we're thinking about psychometrics. And we're extending some of the tools from traditional psychometrics in ways that they're more helpful in environments like simulation and game-based assessment. In particular, for some assessment problems, for some of those feedback cycles, turns out to be handy to use latent variable psychometric models. Not because you think you're measuring something for the sake of measurement, but because you're trying to use models that can capture nuggets of evidence, explore their interrelationships, see how they're related to the decisions that you want to make. So here's some reasons that, at least in some parts, in some games, that we think psychometric models can be helpful. One is that you can use them to synthesize different kinds of evidence. In Pollution City, some of the nuggets of evidence that we're getting look more like from familiar assessments, like when kids are building a little diagram of what the system is as they understand it and what they've seen so far. But also, we're looking for patterns using data mining from logs of actions about different ways that kids tackle bulldozing, dezoning, tearing down the coal-fired plant. Turns out that you can really lower the pollution if you bulldoze down all the factories. That doesn't help on the jobs part. So those are ways that we can look for patterns that kids are doing that show, well, here's a kid who's only looking at sort of a univariate aspect of the system, not looking at the interacting parts. Another thing they can be good for is to gather modular individual types of evidence. If you have a game and people are going down different paths, using different strategies, it's not like a test where everybody takes the same items. So with latent variable models, you can construct on the fly models that recognize certain kinds of evidence, maybe because they're designed in, maybe because we discovered them after we started doing testing and getting data from the field, additional patterns that gave us clues. So we have models that can absorb, synthesize that kind of evidence. Another is to disambiguate, okay, I should have used a different word, disambiguate entangled evidence. There are times when there are different multiple aspects of knowledge or skill that are required in different mixes in different situations. So you can build latent variable models to help sort out the influence of different aspects of knowledge and skill in different situations. And another one is that latent variable models, psychometric models in general, can provide metrics for evidence. One of the things that's really important in game design is what they call A/B testing, or AKA experiments. And that way you can try different strategies of design or different features to see what gives you more engagement, for example. Well, if you have metrics for evidence, you can look at different ways of providing students to respond or to build things or action choices and see which of those might give you better clues about how they're thinking or what they understand. Okay, third one. This one might be the hardest to put into practice, that if you're going to design these things like game-based assessments that require insights and principles and techniques across different fields, you really ought to be bringing those sets of overlapping, but sometimes interacting goals and constraints together from the beginning. Loosely coupled designs, and you iterate a lot. I can't tell you the best way to do this, but for sure I can tell you some bad ways. Bad way is to make a really fun game and say, okay, now how do you score it? Another is to make a really good assessment and say, okay, now how do you make it fun? Here's one of the things that we developed as a representation that came out of our experience working together in Glass Lab. And MJ came up with this name, Evidence-Centered Game Design. And what it's trying to do is take some of the principles from evidence-centered design, which is really more about structure rather than process, and meld that with the process, rapid iterations, lots of play testing and feedback that are the standard in the game industry. So from the very beginning, you're thinking about, from the game point of view, what is the meaning of this? What can people do? What are their actions to move the play, to move the story forward? At the same time, you're thinking about, well, from learning, what are the kinds of knowledge or capabilities that are learning targets? So you want those situations that move the game forward to involve, to some degree, coming to understand what those ways of thinking and what those terms are. And from the assessment point of view, you're putting in there those same actions that move the game ahead, that give you experience thinking about the targeted knowledge, also to give you some nuggets of evidence along the way for whether it's the system, the student, or the teacher, to get some feedback on how that is going and what to do next. In the terms of the system itself, that's moment-by-moment decisions. For the teacher, maybe it's okay at the halfway through, I'll go and talk to certain students. Maybe talk to students I've never talked to before. Let's see. Okay, there's a slide missing, but I'll tell you what was on it. It was a question that came up in a discussion that we had at ETS. When we were talking about, okay, we can do all this game-based assessment, we can have learning that is ubiquitous all the time, getting feedback, will tests become extinct? And I think the answer is yes, tests will become extinct in the same way that dinosaurs are extinct. And that is, dinosaurs are not extinct. They look a lot different. They evolved to have forms that better suit changing conditions. But if you take a chicken and you turn some genes on, turn some off, you get a velociraptor. There's an article about that last month in the Journal of Evil Science. But the point is that these things look really different on the surface, the velociraptor and the chicken, but it's the same underlying principles underneath. And I think the same thing is true of assessments, that there will probably continue to be certain circumstances where the kinds of assessments that we're familiar with will still be useful. But I think there will be other assessments that don't look very much at all like them. They might look like playing games or other learning experiences. And I think to make those work well, we're going to have to bring to bear insights and ways of thinking that come from multiple design domains that in the past didn't have that much to do with one another. But game design is part of the mix, learning, instructional design is part of the mix, and I would suggest assessment design plays a key role as well. Thank you.
Well, thanks everyone. I'm delighted to be here. And in particular, I'd like to take an opportunity to thank the folks at CATS and at IES for allowing me to participate in some of their work and have the opportunity to do the work that I'm going to report to you today. If you want the gory details and dozens of equations, there's the tech report. It's up on the CRESST website. We're not going to get into all that today. We're going to stick to a pretty high level of things. And to get started here, the background and context for the work that I'm going to describe is in one of the games that you've heard a little bit about already, Save Patch. It's a game targeting rational number equivalents and fractions in addition, in which students engage in various levels, and the goal is to get the character patch successfully from the start position to the target, given the layout of the situation and the ropes, and it's kind of like an Indiana Jones thing where you make it across. And so what the student does is they set out the ropes as so desire, they set patch in motion, and they see if patch makes it to the end successfully. And if you do it correctly, you move on to the next level, which become more and more advanced. If not, you try that level again. And if you aren't successful, you try it again. And in some cases, again and again and again before it works. And you've heard a little bit about, in the larger scope of all the games, but in particular for Save Patch, there's been nice research by the CATS team to evidence its utility as a learning experience for, say, pre to post and transfer, and also a little bit as an assessment itself. And that's actually what I'm going to spend some time on today. There's lots of levels in the game. I'm going to focus on analyses of up to level 23. And there's a variety of skills that are targeted by those levels. And there's one skill per each level. Each skill is measured or intended to be measured by a few of the different levels. And my work really built off some extensive work done by Deirdre Kerr and colleagues at CATS on characterization of student behaviors and performances and forming interpretations. So there were cluster analyses of log file data that led to the identification of several different strategies. Some were solution strategies, ways to solve things that got patched successfully to the end. Others were misconceptions that were reflecting of misconceptions about math and fractions. Others related to gameplay, like you didn't pick up the key that unlocks things along the way. I'm not considering those actions in my analyses. And in particular, there were the identification of particular behaviors that reflected these different strategies or misconceptions. So what we have here now, thanks to this work, is a distinction between different types of solutions, which may differentially constitute evidence of proficiency, and different types of errors, which may be reflective of different proficiency, as well as possessing certain particular misconceptions. And in an evidence-centered design frame, this is our evidence identification processes and rules, taking what the student does as captured by the log file and translating it into observable variables with different levels reflecting these behaviors. And in particular, here are some of the possible solution strategies we might see a student do on any particular attempt. We like to see standard solutions. That means they're proceeding through the level in ways that we would have expected for somebody who knows what they're doing. There are other ways to solve some of the levels. Not all of them are relevant to all the levels. Perhaps more interestingly, from a diagnostic perspective, is there's lots of different types of errors that you can make. Some of them are listed there on the left-hand side, and they are reflective of corresponding misconceptions labeled there on the right-hand side. And at the bottom there on the left, there's the category for unknown error. That is, okay, you weren't successful, but we don't really know what you were trying to do. We can't fit what you did into our understanding of different strategies and misconceptions. And again, not all of these were possible or present on every level. Okay. So in describing this, I now want to summarize before we turn to some of the psychometric modeling, what are some of the key features here, in particular that depart from traditional psychometrics? Well, we've got 6 targeted aspects of proficiency, those skills that we really want to measure across 23 levels, and 1 skill for each one. There are 5 misconceptions possible that we identified, linked to particular behaviors, some of which are possible in more circumstances than others. There's some feedback. The student knows, to some extent, if they were correct or incorrect in what they did. If what they did was correct, you move on to the next level. If not, you try the same level. So it's not quite an intervention, it's not quite remediation, but it certainly is feedback that departs from the traditional assessment environment where you don't know how you did until maybe right after the test or much later in certain circumstances. And as a result of the design of the game and of this feedback mechanism, there's the possibility, and we might say hope, of learning, that is, change in proficiency during the game. And in addition, the performances, even if you condition on proficiency, may not be conditionally independent. You're playing the game, you know what you did, you know how it turned out, so does that lead you to maybe not try that again next? Sometimes yes, and sometimes no. So now I want to turn to the work that I did on this, which is constructing and calibrating and illustrating the use of some dynamic Bayesian networks in this context. And to start is a theme that has been touched on several times, which is that games can be appealing assessment environments due to some of the shared structures. Digital-based games afford collection of lots of interesting data that can support more complex assessment arguments than just were you successful or not. It allows us to do things like monitor change and learning over time. There's been some discussion about games as learning, games for learning, games for assessment, and a perspective I like to adopt is that games are assessments. Or one perspective is that they are. They might be low stakes or high stakes. They might have feedback to the student or to some other level. They might be poorly designed assessments. They might be well-designed assessments. But from a certain perspective, that's what assessment is. And so a phrase I like to toss around is that games are just assessments that people don't mind taking, for what that's worth. And from the modeling perspective, Bayesian networks, or Bayes nets, are a pretty promising approach that have been used in games and related sorts of environments, be they simulations, be they tutoring systems, things like that. And what I'm going to do is pretty common, which is set up latent variables to stand for proficiency. Are you a master or not a master of a certain skill, as well as misconceptions. Do you possess that misconception or do you not? And then we have the observable variables as that summary of performance. That's one of those many possible solutions or one of those many possible errors, types of errors we saw you make, or the catch-all unknown error. So here's the setup. At the top here of the figure, we've got a circle with theta in it representing proficiencies and misconceptions. There's just one, but the big idea is that there's potentially lots of relevant proficiency and misconceptions that might influence performance. And down there at the bottom in the rectangle for x, that's our observable variable for your performance, our summary of that. And the arrow linking them indicates that the model is such that your performance depends on your proficiency and misconceptions. That's our psychometric modeling story. And we have some theory about this. We have theories that say, well, gee, people who have mastered the relevant skills, they ought to perform better on those tasks than if you haven't mastered the skills. And folks who have certain misconceptions, they're more likely to behave in certain ways than if they don't have those misconceptions. And that's sort of a soft theory. It's not very precise. We don't know how much more likely masters are to solve things correctly than non-masters. We have big ideas or sort of big picture theory, but not as concrete. So Bayes nets are useful. What I'm going to turn to is dynamic Bayes nets that go by a couple of different names in related literatures. So if you connect with any of those, it might be something that you can hook into. And the idea now is that here's the same picture, only now I've indexed things by t representing time. So we have your proficiency and misconceptions at a particular time, and then your performance. And what we do is we think and we model how things change over time in discrete slices. So here's the next time slice at time t plus 1. And the story that we're going to build is that, well, gee, your proficiency at any particular time depends on your proficiency just before. One of the theories we have here is once you've mastered a skill, you've always mastered the skill. You don't forget it. This is a theory that was imposed. There's also transitions from non-mastery to mastery of skills. Transitions away from misconceptions. I had a misconception, now I no longer have the misconception. And sometimes transitions to misconceptions, as we saw. I didn't have this misconception, but now I'm really struggling with something. I think this might be a good way to go, but no, in fact, it's not. It's really reflective of a misconception. In addition to proficiency depending on past proficiency, it also additionally depends on past performance. You know what you just did. You know what you just tried. And so in addition to however proficient you might have been, what you just did ought to influence your transition to proficiency. Okay. So here's the big picture all at once. So when people have used things like Bayes nets and dynamic Bayes nets in games and related environments, usually the model structure, what connects with what, and the conditional probabilities, the parameters that go in, are typically specified in advance for subject matter experts. But we might have a desire to calibrate the models and do things like estimate the strengths of those relationships. And it occurs to me we might wonder why. I think Candace said yesterday there's the natural human drive to do statistics. So that's one reason. This is fun for me. But in addition, there's a couple of other reasons. A topic I haven't heard discussed much at this meeting is different stakes. And in high stakes, if high stakes are attached to assessments, we often, for a variety of research as well as legal reasons, do things like go get some data and see what they tell us before using it operationally. But even from a research perspective, even in low stakes environments, we have, at this point in the process, a combination of hard and soft theory, is what I like to say, firm and weak beliefs about what's going on. And so let's go get some data and combine that with what we think. Yeah, masters ought to do better than non-masters. We're pretty sure about that. That's kind of our definition of mastery of skills. But how much better? Well, I don't know. Let me see what the data tell me. There are challenges to doing this type of estimation and model fitting. Typically with these sorts of models, they've been used with dichotomous latent and observable variables. Observable being like, did you do it right or wrong? Well, I've got an observable that can take on about 18 different values corresponding to different solution or error approaches. So that presents challenges, as well as the longitudinal dependent structures that I mentioned. So as I was thinking about how to do this, I eventually settled on something, and I'm not going to present the Gorey equations, but they're related to things in the diagnostic classification modeling literature, in particular the recent work by Lainey Bradshaw and John Templin. I like to think about them in a multidimensional IRT perspective, but there's a variety of other ways to do it. A fully Bayesian approach allows us to impose prior distributions that reflect our substantive theory. It also helps with a bunch of technical problems that I don't have time to get into today. We have a specification that says, let me think about the probability of transitioning for latent variables. So I have the probability of being a master at a later time given my previous level of proficiency. Data sparseness is an issue. There's some logical problems about this that I don't have time to get into, but I should have anticipated them, but I didn't. I found them along the way. Turns out a fully Bayesian approach also helped here. So to get into this, we did some model fitting with over 800 students playing the game. I did this in OpenBugs software, which is the most complicated OpenBugs code that I ever wrote. It crashed the software quite a bit. I had to parse it up into different groups, but again, a hierarchical prior helped this. And just to very quickly look at some of the sorts of results, here's level 19 in the game. And the top row says, hey, if you're a master of the skill and you don't possess a particular misconception, you're going to do the standard solution most of the time. If you're a non-master, well, you're not going to do the standard solution. As often, you're more likely to make a particular error we interpret or an unknown error. And all of those numbers go down if you also possess a misconception. Thinking about the transition, this says, gee, if you were a master before you attempted this, then no matter what you do, you're a master afterwards. That's the theory, once a master, always a master of skill. But if you were a non-master and you did the right solution strategy, you got a pretty good chance of transitioning to mastery. And even if you made a particular type of error, you might transition to mastery. How about the misconceptions? Well, the bottom row says, well, if you didn't possess the misconception and you do the right thing, you don't acquire the misconception. But if you don't have the misconception and you're struggling and you're doing some things wrong, you might actually start to adopt a misconception. Up here, if you have the misconception and you start giving us some of the solutions, you got a pretty good chance of transitioning away from it. And in particular, what this tells us is if you have the misconception that tends to lead to this kind of behavior, you're only going to keep it about 30% of the time. You're going to get away from that misconception about 70% of the time in this level. Okay. How might we use this? Well, here's just some graphics that relate the student's probability of mastery of the different skills across the levels. The x-axis here is the different attempts. They're spaced out based on when they started a level. You can see the student struggled with level 6. It took them multiple attempts to solve them. This is a reflection of the model-based reasoning about, well, what is their levels of proficiency with each attempt? And you can see it often goes up, and then they do things wrong, and then this is a reflection of our thinking as the assessor about what they know. And the graph didn't show up as nicely, here? The graph didn't show up as nicely here because for some reason I lost the colors, but this is all the different misconceptions, and we have different probabilities reflecting our beliefs about whether the student has that misconception at each of the time points. So I just want to wrap up with some concluding thoughts here. Game-based argumentation, game-based assessment argumentation, as Bob was discussing, is potentially very powerful. And from my perspective, it has the openness of the workspace in this case. Let the student do what they want to do on the level. There's lots of different things they might do. This offers enormous potential to see how students behave. So does the digital data collection. This appeal is also the challenge, what to pay attention to and how to reason from it to the inferences we'd like to make. The work that I did really built upon the foundational work of knowing what to pay attention to. So this is really a case study for me in evidentiary reasoning throughout the entire process. Lee talked about it in his talk a little bit yesterday about thinking about claims and evidence as part of the design of these games. The cluster analyses that identified particular behaviors and linked them to particular misconceptions, that's identifying nuggets of evidence. And then where I get to come in with this work is how to use statistical modeling to instantiate our reasoning and perform those inferences. This is a situation we have challenges to traditional psychometrics for the reasons discussed. And what I'm coming to believe is that these types of models are extremely flexible and ready to meet that challenge. And in addition, ready to situate in that space where we don't have to just rely on theory alone or on hopefully nice informative data alone. We have some hard and fast beliefs beforehand, some that are weaker. We can model those beliefs with firmer or weaker constraints in the model, and then we learn from data. And the last thought is that this model is an imperfect representation of what we as the assessment team think, which is itself an imperfect set of beliefs about what's going on when students do things. And so to recognize that imperfection and then try to build off that would be next steps. So with that,
thank you, Rogi.
Thank you for your time.
So I perhaps mistakenly assumed that my assignment here was primarily to talk about Lee's talk. I could say a couple of things about the other talks, although I don't have as much knowledge to bring to bear on the others. But I thought I would start by telling a story. I don't know how many people in the audience know Valerie Lee, who was my former colleague at the University of Michigan, a wonderful, productive researcher and a very determined and outspoken. And this part of her personality was expressed at a meeting at the AERA a few years ago. She had a grant from the National Center for Education Statistics to reanalyze data from NAEP. And she had a very creative idea. The idea was to link the data from NAEP to transcript data that she had arduously pulled together And she thought certain aspects of course taking would predict NAEP results. She was disheartened to find that the null hypothesis was retained pretty much uniformly. And she went back to the people who gave her the grant from NCES and said, I'm just shocked that the null hypothesis is being retained. And then they told her, well, really, you could never really do that study with NAEP because those variables that you got from the transcripts were not part of the conditioning process used to generate the plausible values of NAEP. So of course, having spent the better part of a year on this project, this was not good news to Valerie. And I think that Lee is bringing us some fascinating news that's kind of similar. Can you hear me? Okay. He seems to be telling us that, that if we do psychrometric scaling as the first stage of a process, because let me just say about NAEP, as you all know, NAEP had a two-step process in her case. The first was to generate the plausible values using missing data methods, and then she exported those data into a new data set where she did the analysis. And so what seems to be happening here is that with Lee is that psychometrics is giving us in the first stage scaled scores, and then in the second stage we're doing experiments. And of course the treatments that we're using in the second stage were not part of the conditioning process that went into the first stage, and as a result we're getting a bias. And I think this is incredibly important insight. Are you still there? Okay, good, because every now and then on my screen you freeze. But so when I first thought about this, I thought about a very simple case where we have a score, call it Y, for each person. Each person has a true proficiency, call it theta. There's a certain reliability. And if we do shrinkage to get the best estimate we can of theta using an empirical Bayes or Bayes shrinkage, we're going to get a negatively biased estimate of the impact of an intervention. And it's going to be biased proportional to the reliability of the scale, the unreliability actually. But it occurred to me this really isn't going to be a problem, because if we do the standardized effect size, the standard deviation is going to be biased by the exact same amount, and when we do the division, everything's going to work out fine. Well, it doesn't work out fine, and I think I understand why, and maybe Lee can correct me if I have a misconception here. Because there's a problem. Not only do the items have different reliability, and therefore, the ability estimates have different degrees of reliability and therefore experience different shrinkage, but in fact, the items are differentially sensitive to instruction. And what this means is that we could easily see that members of the experimental group who would benefit only on those items that were sensitive to instruction. And so from a psychometric point of view, it would create an odd situation where the people in the experimental group would have a subset of items that were high in magnitude, and but whereas the items that are not sensitive to instruction would not be high, and they would look like a bunch of measurement errors, and so their scores would be shrunk. And if I'm understanding this correctly, and this seems fairly convincing, then we are in a bundle of trouble in terms of how we're doing psychometrics and how we're doing experimentation. And it's really difficult to think about how we solve the problem. The thing we could do is could carry the full item data set along with each experimental analysis, so that every time we do the study of a new intervention, we embed in it a full-blown item factor analysis model inside the model that we're using to evaluate the impact of the treatment But there's problems with this. One is that's a big analytic burden for a lot of people who do experimentation. It requires an enormous amount of skill and expertise. Secondly, we're importing a lot of assumptions from the psychometrics into the analytic model that some people are not going to want to make. There are a lot of normality assumptions and other assumptions. And then this issue of sample size that came up at the end of the last discussion. Some of these experiments are not such large sample studies, and we may not have adequate sample size to do the full-blown item factor analysis and simultaneously the evaluation of the intervention. So I think what that says, if I understand this correctly, and I would really like to hear Lee's feedback or that of anybody else, is that we have to think about perhaps more robust ways of providing analysts information. That is, the psychometricians need to figure out, or we need to figure out, all of us, how to create more robust information, what some kinds of, I'm not sure if it would be sufficient statistics, or non-shrunk information that could somehow be used, and we could develop some software to solve this problem. I'm not sure how this is going to go. But it's a huge problem, and I think it applies not only in experimental designs, but in fact, it applies to all of our estimates of variance components. So for example, if all of our estimates of school effects, interclass correlation coefficients, fractions of variance, the psychometrics are being done under the null hypothesis that we have essentially no levels in the data. But in the analysis, the hierarchical linear models that we're going to use, we do have, of course, multi-level data. So we're going to be, I'm afraid, struggling with the Valerie Lee problem here. So that's really this is a huge insight, I think, that Lee has come up with, and it poses us with some really big challenges. I might want to just comment briefly on the games. I'm really fascinated by this, and I think it has an interesting application, set of applications. What we see now happening more and more, and particularly in elementary schools, is a series of formative assessments, after which there is an instructional plan devised for each student, and we then test out the instruction by having another formative assessment. And so we have this dynamic interplay between the assessment and the instruction, and I think that you could, and this really goes with the last presentation, we could productively regard this as a game. That instruction is a game. It is a dynamic interplay. We're trying to optimize the input. And the work of Susan Murphy, a statistician at Michigan, I think is highly relevant in what she calls optimal dynamic treatment regimes. I think the dynamism runs both ways. Dynamically, we want to tailor the instruction to what we're learning about the child. So the game is actually being played on the teacher as well as the child. And also, we want to tailor the assessment. The teachers only have 10 or 15 minutes to assess each child in these formative assessment schemes. We need to optimize, almost in the spirit of computerized adaptive testing, the selection of items for the child. So I think that the game metaphor and the technology and the Bayes nets that are going along with it have potentially very large applications in the improvement instruction. Thank you.